The glass doors parted at exactly 9 o'clock. Marcus Bennett stepped into the Bennett Financial Branch that bore his name right in the heart of downtown Chicago. Sunlight streamed through the towering windows, casting golden lines across the polished marble floor, each beam catching the motion of shoes and shadow. The air inside was perfectly tempered, humming with the quiet order of routine. Employees moved with synchronized precision suits, unwrinkled expressions focused. Clients stood in calm lines. The soft chime of the service bell rang at even intervals, like the ticking of a well-disciplined world. Nothing was frantic, no chaos. Everything felt composed, measured, and flawlessly intact. And yet, within minutes, that fragile surface would begin to fracture. Marcus was not here as the CEO today. No media appearance, no stakeholder briefing, no announcement to deliver. He wore no tailored suit, no Rolex, no insignia of power. Just a light blue shirt, neatly pressed, pale khaki pants, and spotless white sneakers. He was not here to be seen. He did not want to be recognized. This was meant to be a routine transaction, a personal cash withdrawal, $15,000. A sum any customer should be able to withdraw without questions, without suspicion, without judgment. But what Marcus was about to encounter was not new. It was an echo of moments he had lived through countless times before in places where his name meant nothing. And now, of all places, it had found its way here, inside the very institution he had built. He stepped further inside, eyes sweeping across the lobby. Nothing had changed. Clean, minimal, designed to feel dignified. His fingerprints were in every corner, from the architecture to the workflow. But it was not the surroundings that held his attention. It was what was happening at the counter ahead. A middle-aged white man in a charcoal blazer was smiling as he spoke with the teller. The young woman behind the glass was counting thick stacks of cash with practiced ease. No forms, no pauses, no suspicion, just effortless service. When she handed over the money, Marcus caught a glimpse of the transaction slip, $20,000. Not a question asked. The man placed the bills into a leather case, nodded politely, and walked out without a second glance. Marcus watched him go. His face was calm, unreadable, but beneath it his jaw set tight. He had seen this before, felt it before. The silent split between who gets questioned and who does not. But not today, not here, not in Bennett Financial. He walked toward the teller counter's posture, steady gaze even. The line was short. In a few quiet seconds, it was his turn. The woman behind the glass looked at him, or rather, through him. Blonde hair tied back, navy blazer crisp and fitted. The name tag read Amy Carter. No smile, no greeting, no acknowledgement. She bent down, pulled a form from a drawer, and pushed it toward him across the counter. Her motion was mechanical. "Fill this out," she said, voice flat, almost uninterested. No warmth, no politeness, just a sterile instruction wrapped in formality. Marcus studied her for a moment, then looked down. Standard withdrawal slip. Nothing wrong with the form. What was wrong was her tone. He took out a pen, filled it quickly, and slid it back along with his driver's license. Amy took the paper but did not glance at the ID. Her eyes landed on the number he had written, and in the next second she pushed both items back across the counter. "We cannot process this transaction," she said, folding her arms. Marcus raised his brows, slightly, fingertips grazing the edge of the returned paper. "Excuse me," said, voice controlled. "Is there a problem?" She did not blink. Large withdrawals like this are not handled here. Marcus tilted his head slightly, calm, firm. "I just saw someone withdraw even more than this." He nodded toward the glass doors where the white customer was still visible outside. "You did not even hesitate with him." Amy's mouth pressed into a thin line. "That was different," she replied. Marcus leaned in, voice low, clear. "How exactly was it different?" Her gaze flicked away, not out of fear, but out of something else. A quiet calculation. She glanced toward the office behind the glass wall. Marcus did not need to turn to know who was standing there. Victoria Sanders, sharp suit, colder eyes. The kind of manager who had already made her decision before asking any questions. Their eyes met. She gave a subtle nod, barely noticeable, but Amy saw it. Straightened her back. Her confidence returned like a switch had been flipped. She turned to Marcus again. "This transaction cannot be processed," she said. Her voice held the finality of a door closing. But Marcus Bennett had never been one to accept closed doors in a house he built himself. Marcus did not flinch. He let the silence hang for a second longer, let Amy believe she had won this round. Then, without breaking eye contact, he spoke. "I just want to understand why you processed $20,000 for him and not 15 for me. That is not an accusation, just a question." But his tone was even too deliberate. Amy shifted slightly, her confidence cracking. She opened her mouth, then paused. Her eyes darted once more toward the glass office behind her, the one she had already borrowed strength from. Victoria Sanders was still standing there, arms crossed, unmoved. Her expression was sharp, unreadable, the kind that measured people before they even spoke. Marcus saw the hesitation ripple through Amy's shoulders, but she masked it quickly. "I do not make the rules, sir," she said. Her voice sounded like a script memorized and hollow. "Then maybe you can explain why the rules only seem to apply to people who look like me." Marcus did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The weight of his words pressed into the space between them, with all the subtlety of a blade laid gently against skin. Amy's lips tightened. "I'm going to get my manager," she said. She turned without waiting for a response, her heels clicking as she disappeared into the back office. Marcus stood still. His fingers tapped once against the counter, a slow rhythm, matching the quiet thump of his pulse. He felt the air shift, a subtle change like the room itself had begun to hold its breath. Eyes glanced sideways. Telltale signs of discomfort. A few feet away, a woman in her 50s pretended to study a brochure, though her eyes occasionally flicked toward him. Lisa Parker, according to the name tag on her purse. His fingers tapped once against the counter, a slow rhythm matching the quiet thump of his pulse. He felt the air shift, a subtle change like the room itself had begun to hold its breath. Eyes glanced sideways, telltale signs of discomfort. A few feet away, a woman in her 50s pretended to study a brochure, though her eyes occasionally flicked toward him. Lisa Parker, according to the name tag on her purse. Her heels met the tile floor with a rhythm that reminded Marcus of courtrooms and closing deals. Amy followed closely behind, her chin lifted slightly higher now. Victoria approached the counter with the poised efficiency of someone trained to handle complaints without ever accepting blame. "Good morning, sir," she said, her tone smooth, her face unreadable. "I understand you are attempting to make a large withdrawal today." Marcus held her gaze. "I am. Unfortunately, we have protocols in place for withdrawals of this size," she said. Her words were practiced, each syllable wrapped in a layer of corporate politeness. "For the safety of our staff and clients, we require additional steps." Marcus kept his arms relaxed, his posture easy. "So what does that mean for me?" Victoria offered a sympathetic smile, the kind designed to look soft, but always felt like stone. "It means we need to verify the origin of the funds and confirm your most recent deposit." He nodded once. "You have my account in front of you. Look it up." Her lips pressed together. "That is not how we do things here." Marcus blinked, then let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "That is interesting, because I have banked here for years, and this is the first time I have been treated like this. So tell me, Victoria, what exactly about me makes you think I should not be trusted?" Her jaw tensed. The mask of composure cracked barely. She hesitated. Then, without turning her head, she raised one hand and made a small gesture across the room. Subtle, commanding. A figure moved near the entrance. Ethan Reynolds, the bank's head of security. Tall, broad-shouldered, early 30s, white. His posture shifted the moment the signal came. He straightened eyes, scanning the scene, and began to move. Marcus saw him coming. He did not step back. He did not speak. He simply waited. Ethan walked toward the counter with the deliberate weight of someone who assumed authority had already been granted. Victoria said nothing. She did not need to. The message had been sent. Marcus looked at her one more time. "You are really going to do this," he said. His voice low steady. "You are about to remove a customer without checking the facts, without verifying a thing." Victoria did not blink. "Can you verify the source of your funds?" she asked. Her tone now colder, thinner, as if forced into resolve. "My paycheck," Marcus replied, "same as every other time I have deposited money." "And the amount?" Her voice did not rise, but her presence seemed to expand. Marcus stared at her, not answering. The silence drew in the entire room. The tellers froze. Clients shifted in discomfort. No one wanted to be involved yet. All were drawn in by the tension that had quietly overtaken the space. Lisa Parker looked like she wanted to speak. She did not. Not yet. Ethan Reynolds had now arrived beside Marcus. His stance said enough. This was no longer a conversation. This was a removal. "I am going to ask you to step outside," Ethan said, his voice neutral. Not threatening, just cold. Marcus turned his head slowly, his eyes locked onto Ethan, searching for something. Doubt. Understanding, recognition, nothing. The man had already made up his mind. And just like that, the morning stopped being routine. Marcus did not step back. He stayed exactly where he was, eyes locked with the man whose hand now hovered inches from his body, waiting for permission to act. Ethan Reynolds stood firm, his bulk casting a shadow across the polished counter, his presence meant to intimidate. But Marcus did not move. He inhaled, once steady, deliberate. "I am standing in the bank I built," he said quietly. "I gave you everything you needed to confirm who I am. My ID, my account, my history. And yet here we are, still pretending this is about policy." Victoria said nothing. She stood just behind Ethan, her arms crossed, face composed, but Marcus saw it in the way her jaw shifted. A small signal of irritation, not guilt, not shame, just the annoyance of being challenged. Ethan repeated his line, this time slower, firmer. "Sir, step outside with me." Marcus reached into his pocket, his motion careful and visible. No sudden movements, no room for misinterpretation. He pulled out his phone, tapped once, and lifted it between them, recording now. His voice was calm, his words crisp. "You are refusing to process my withdrawal, even with identification and account verification, while another customer moments ago received more than I requested without question." Amy tensed behind the counter. Victoria's face froze. Ethan glanced briefly toward her, uncertain now. Still, his orders were clear. "Step outside," Ethan said again. The woman behind the glass looked at him, or rather, through him. Blonde hair, tied back navy blazer, crisp and fitted. The name tag read Amy Carter. No smile, no greeting, no acknowledgement. She bent down, pulled a form from a drawer, and pushed it toward him across the counter. Her motion was mechanical. "Fill this out," she said, voice flat, almost uninterested. No warmth, no politeness, just a sterile instruction wrapped in formality. Marcus studied her for a moment, then looked down. Someone whispered something under their breath. No one intervened. Marcus caught himself before he felt the soles of his sneakers squealing softly against the marble as he was shoved again. This time harder. His back struck the glass door, a sharp jolt running through his spine. He gritted his teeth, but made no sound. He would not give them that. The door opened behind him, and the morning air rushed in like a slap to the face. And then it was done. He was outside. Behind him, Ethan remained by the door, arms crossed, face unreadable. And then came the final insult. His ID, the one they refused to acknowledge, was tossed through the air and hit the concrete with a flat, hollow sound. Marcus stared down at it. A simple piece of plastic, the proof of who he was, discarded like trash. Something clenched deep in his chest. A heat that was not surprise, not confusion, but a raw, controlled fury. But before he could move, a shape stepped beside him. She clutched her bag tighter, like the act of watching silently had a weight of its own. Their eyes met briefly. She offered a faint, unsure smile. Marcus did not return it. Not because he was angry at her, but because he already knew how this would go. People like Lisa noticed they whispered, but they rarely did anything more than watch. The door behind the counter swung open. Victoria Sanders stepped out. "And if I don't," Marcus replied, still filming what exactly happens next. Ethan did not respond. Instead, he reached out his fingers, wrapping around Marcus's forearm, applying pressure. Marcus braced himself, his body shifting just enough to remain upright as Ethan yanked him back, turning him toward the exit. The sudden motion made his shoulder twist, the sharp impact radiating through his back as he stumbled forward. A few gasps broke the silence. The number was already saved. He tapped once. It rang. Then a voice answered, crisp, direct. Marcus spoke only 7 words. I need you at the branch. Now. A beat of silence followed. Then a breath on the other end. I will be there in 15. Marcus hung up, slid the phone back into his pocket. Jamal stood beside him, still silent, still watching. The street outside the bank carried on as if nothing had happened. Cars passed. Pedestrians moved. But through the glass, the interior of the branch looked frozen in place. Victoria was back near the counter. Amy was typing something into the computer. Ethan remained at the door, occasionally flicking his gaze toward Marcus, but never holding it. Lisa Parker had vanished, gone like so many others, who saw what happened but decided their silence was easier to live with. Marcus adjusted his stance, shoulders squared, eyes calm. The wind picked up slightly, fluttering the hem of his shirt. He pulled out his phone, tapped once, and lifted it between them. Recording now. His voice was calm, his words crisp. You are refusing to process my withdrawal, even with identification and account verification, while another customer moments ago received more than I requested without question. Amy tensed behind the counter. Victoria's face froze. Ethan glanced briefly toward her, uncertain now. Still, his orders were clear. Step outside, Ethan said again. The city moved around him, unaware or uninterested in the quiet storm that had just unfolded behind those tall glass doors. Marcus stood still, his ID now tucked safely back in his wallet, his phone back in his pocket. Jamal remained beside him, hands on hips, his breath shallow, as if he too was preparing for something inevitable. 15 minutes never felt this long. From where he stood, Marcus could see inside the branch, see Amy now laughing nervously as she spoke to another teller. The cold efficiency that once felt like progress now just felt like performance. He walked slowly, each step echoing louder than the last. When he reached the center of the lobby, he stopped. Everyone watched. The customers, the tellers, the security staff who had said nothing. He looked once more toward Victoria, her face pale, now no longer confident, no longer untouchable. You should have looked at my ID, he said. The words were simple, flat, final. Not yet. Ethan Reynolds had now arrived beside Marcus. His stance said enough. This was no longer a conversation. This was a removal. I am going to ask you to step outside, Ethan said, his voice neutral, not threatening, just cold. Marcus turned his head slowly, his eyes locked onto Ethan, searching for something. Doubt, understanding, recognition, nothing. The man had already made up his mind. And just like that, the morning stopped being routine. A second guard, mid-30s, black, tired. Not in body, but in spirit. The kind of tired that comes from 1,000 small humiliations stacked beneath a uniform. Jamal Brooks. He crouched down, picked up the ID, and dusted it gently. His fingers careful, almost reverent. When he handed it back to Marcus, their hands brushed. This place, Jamal muttered, just loud enough, always does this. Marcus took the ID silently. Jamal looked away, exhaled. Amy noticed a beat later. The color drained from her cheeks, her fingers frozen mid-keystroke. The tellers stopped pretending they weren't watching. Now they watched, fully, openly. Because suddenly, it mattered. Mr. Carter Victoria greeted her voice only slightly too high, her expression only slightly too tight. I wasn't aware you were visiting this morning. That is clear, David replied, his voice calm but cold. Because if you had known, this would not be happening. And then he waited. Because this was not over. Then let's begin. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His presence was louder than any shouting. You refused a withdrawal from our CEO, he said, evenly pointing toward Marcus without needing to use his name. A man with full identification, full account access, full credentials. Amy began to speak a stammering explanation half-formed. I was following protocol, she managed her voice unsteady. Protocol David repeated, his eyes narrowing slightly. Is that what we are calling this? Racial profiling wrapped in bank policy. No one spoke. Amy's hands trembled slightly. Victoria tried to interject. Sir, there may have been a misunderstanding. No misunderstanding, David said, slicing through her words. Just decisions. Bad ones. Unacceptable ones. He turned his gaze on Victoria fully now. Did you check his account before making that call? Yes or no? Victoria hesitated barely a fraction of a second, but it was all the confirmation he needed. David took a slow breath. Not yet. Ethan Reynolds had now arrived beside Marcus. His stance said enough. This was no longer a conversation. This was a removal. I am going to ask you to step outside, Ethan said, his voice neutral. Not threatening, just cold. Marcus turned his head slowly. His eyes locked onto Ethan's, searching for something. Doubt, understanding, recognition, nothing. The man had already made up his mind. And just like that, the morning stopped being routine. He was not just well-dressed, he was deliberate. Every detail of his appearance said something. Not here to ask, not here to wait, and certainly not here to clean up anyone else's mistakes quietly. David moved fast. He crossed the sidewalk with the confidence of someone who had written the rules that others were fumbling to follow. Ethan straightened the moment he saw him, recognition flickering too late in his eyes. David did not acknowledge him. He turned to Jamal, who stood just a few feet behind, still unsure whether he was allowed to exist in this moment. And you, he said, his voice softer but no less firm. What is your name? Jamal Brooks, sir. David studied him a moment. You're promoted. Effective today. Jamal blinked. Sir, you deserve better than this, and I need people who see what others look away from. Behind them, Victoria opened her mouth again. But the moment had passed. Her authority had evaporated. Silence fell again. The kind of silence that speaks louder than chaos. Victoria stood frozen, her voice trapped somewhere between apology and desperation. Amy's eyes were glassy, now her hands clasped tightly in front of her, shrinking under the weight of a decision she once believed she could justify. Ethan remained by the glass door, no longer a pillar of authority, now merely a man unsure of where to stand when the tide has turned. And standing in the eye of that unraveling storm was Marcus, calm, still, unshaken. David gestured toward the counter. Process his withdrawal, he said. Not a question, not a suggestion. Amy did not argue. She moved slowly, fingers trembling slightly as she typed into the system. The monitor blinked to life. She paused for half a second, maybe less, then looked up. "Everything is in order," she murmured. "Of course it is," David replied flatly. The machine behind her whirred softly. Seconds later, she slid a neat stack of bills across the counter. Amy noticed a beat later. The color drained from her cheeks, her fingers frozen mid-keystroke. The tellers stopped pretending they weren't watching. Now they watched, fully, openly, because suddenly it mattered. Mr. Carter Victoria greeted her voice only slightly too high, her expression only slightly too tight. "I wasn't aware you were visiting this morning." "That is clear," David replied, his voice calm but cold, "because if you had known, this would not be happening." $15,000. Crisp, counted, silent. Marcus reached for the cash. His movements exact, deliberate, but his gaze never left Amy's face. He did not say thank you. He did not offer a nod. This was not service. This was not kindness. This was correction. At the edge of his vision, he caught Jamal still standing off to the side, his eyes scanning the room as if trying to convince himself it was real. Marcus turned, took a step toward him, and without a word extended one of the stacks. Behind him, Ethan remained by the door, arms crossed, face unreadable. And then came the final insult. His ID, the one they refused to acknowledge, was tossed through the air and hit the concrete with a flat, hollow sound. Marcus stared down at it. A simple piece of plastic, the proof of who he was, discarded like trash. Something clenched deep in his chest. A heat that was not surprise, not confusion, but a raw, controlled fury. But before he could move, a shape stepped beside him. But in them was the weight of every door he had forced open. Every room he had been forced to prove himself in. Every silent slight dressed up as procedure. And then, without another glance, Marcus turned and walked toward the exit. No one moved to stop him. No one dared. The doors opened smoothly like they always had. The light outside seemed brighter than before. He stepped out, his shoulders back, his grip firm around the envelope now tucked in his coat. Behind him, the branch that bore his name faded into the morning crowd. A place that once stood for everything he had built now reminded him why it had to be built in the first place. Not just for wealth, not just for power, but because spaces like that were never made for men like him until he made them. The wind cut across the sidewalk, crisp, clean, and for the first time that morning, Marcus allowed himself a breath that did not carry the weight of restraint. In that breath was victory, yes, but also exhaustion, the kind of tired that only comes from years of being watched, doubted, resisted, erased. But beneath that deeper still was something more powerful. A kind of resolve that does not speak in anger but in action, that does not announce itself but simply exists, unshakable. Jamal followed behind a few steps, eyes wide, posture still stunned by what had happened. Marcus did not speak. He did not need to. He walked past him like he was part of the scenery. The glass doors parted open at his presence, as if the building itself understood what had just arrived. Marcus followed. Jamal hesitated, then fell into step behind him. Inside, the air shifted. It always did when true power entered a room. Victoria turned first. Her eyes widened in that split second before her training took over. She smoothed her blazer, adjusted her stance, and forced her features back into something resembling control. Later that day, long after the last customer had stepped out and the blinds had been pulled shut, a meeting took place behind the same glass walls that had once ignored Marcus. The walls had seen everything: the tension, the dismissal, the fall, and now they witnessed the reckoning. Victoria was gone, her office cleared, her nameplate removed in less than an hour. Amy, too, had been escorted out, her workstation logged out, her chair left empty, still slightly turned from the chaos of the morning. But through the glass, the interior of the branch looked frozen in place. Victoria was back near the counter. Amy was typing something into the computer. Ethan remained at the door, occasionally flicking his gaze toward Marcus, but never holding it. Lisa Parker had vanished, gone like so many others who saw what happened but decided their silence was easier to live with. Marcus adjusted his stance, shoulders squared, eyes calm. The wind picked up slightly, fluttering the hem of his shirt. The message had already been delivered, not with shouting, not with threats, but with truth, with presence, with proof. This was his bank, his name on the walls, his values in the foundation. And from this day forward, no one inside those walls would forget that. But through the glass, the interior of the branch looked frozen in place. Victoria was back near the counter. Amy was typing something into the computer. Ethan remained at the door, occasionally flicking his gaze toward Marcus, but never holding it. Lisa Parker had vanished, gone like so many others, who saw what happened, but decided their silence was easier to live with. Marcus adjusted his stance, shoulders squared, eyes calm. The wind picked up slightly, fluttering the hem of his shirt. A tension hung over the office like storm clouds. Some feared retaliation, others feared accountability. But those who had watched silently that morning now felt something heavier: shame. Not because they had acted, but because they hadn't. Because they had seen it happen in front of them and chosen the safest thing: to do nothing. And that Marcus thought was always the most dangerous part. Not the bigoted words, not the confrontations, but the comfort of indifference. That afternoon, Jamal stood at the security desk, his uniform unchanged, but his posture different, straighter, not just from the promotion, but from the moment he had chosen not to look away. A few employees passed him, offering nods they had never given before. Small gestures, but enough. Marcus paused beside him before heading to his car. "You good?" he asked. Jamal nodded. "It's been a day." Marcus allowed himself a half smile. Get used to days like this. Change doesn't ask permission. It happens. Jamal looked at him, then, eyes steady. "You think they'll learn?" Marcus didn't answer right away. He looked back at the building, at the logo still etched into the glass, at the people inside. Some typing, some waiting, some still too stunned to process. They'll have to, or they'll leave. He said it plainly, without triumph, without pride. Just certainty. Because the truth was, Marcus didn't need apologies. He didn't need tears or statements or public performance. He needed action, and action started here. As he got into his car, the city moved on around him. Horns blaring, people crossing streets, shops opening for lunch service. The world didn't stop. It never did. Not for injustice, not for accountability, not even for change. But Marcus didn't need the world to stop. He just needed it to see, to feel, to remember, and most of all, to understand that men like him were not anomalies, not exceptions, not rare acts of resilience. They were builders, visionaries. See Victoria's sharp profile as she reviewed something on a clipboard with unnecessary force. See Ethan, still stationed by the door, still wearing that mask of indifference like a uniform. And then, without warning, the black sedan arrived. A sleek shadow slicing through the flow of morning traffic. The driver barely had time to shift into park before the door swung open and David Carter stepped out. White, early 50s, silver-threaded hair, cut close, tailored suit, dark as judgment. 2 days passed. Enough time for the headlines to die, but not long enough for the dust to settle inside the walls of Bennett Financial. The board had requested a closed-door meeting. Not to challenge Marcus, not anymore, but to understand, to protect what remained of their image. They spoke in practiced tones, the kind that wrapped questions inside compliments. What can we do to move forward? How can we make this right? Do you think a public apology would help? Marcus listened silent. Their words floated like vapor, insubstantial, as though rehearsed for a press release, as though $15,000 and a bruised reputation were the only things lost. One of the directors, a man named Prescott, leaned forward, palms folded neatly. His tie was perfect, his smile tighter than usual. Marcus, he said, I want to personally express my regret for what happened. That was not who we are. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Then who were you? The room stilled. Prescott blinked, caught off guard. We are committed to equity, he began, to diversity, to accountability. Marcus leaned slightly forward. You've been on the board for 6 years. Have you ever asked how many black customers get flagged for extra security checks? Prescott hesitated. I don't have that number offhand. Marcus nodded. Exactly. He let the silence settle in. Let them sit in the discomfort they were so used to avoiding. You want to fix this, he said finally. Founders. And they would no longer wait to be seen. He didn't wait for promises. He walked out of the boardroom with the same calm he had walked into that bank lobby. The difference now was gravity. Every step he took carried the weight of a shift, not just in power, but in narrative. The next morning, an internal email was sent to every Bennett Financial employee from the desk of Marcus Bennett. A statement, but not the kind written by PR. It was direct. This is what happened. This is what will change. This is what will no longer be tolerated. Then stop managing image and start managing behavior. No more optics, no more platitudes. I want system logs reviewed monthly. I want implicit bias training that doesn't end after a slideshow. And I want the people we promote to reflect the people who walk through our doors, not just the ones who sit in this room. His voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. The truth, when spoken plainly, didn't shout. It demanded stillness. After the meeting, he didn't linger. He didn't shake hands. On the screen, security footage from that morning. He watched it without blinking. Amy pushing the form back. Victoria nodding behind the glass. Ethan reaching for his arm. Jamal stepping in. David arriving. The shift in posture, the unraveling. He watched not to relive it, but to study it. Not just the actions, but the spaces between them, the moments where someone could have spoken but didn't. The glance exchanged, the breath held, the second too late. Because that's where the real danger lived. Not in overt racism, but in the pause before resistance, the shrug, the choice not to see. He closed the laptop, exhaled slowly. Change was coming, but it would not arrive by memo. It would arrive in the space between instinct and action. It would arrive when silence was no longer safe. And he would be watching. A week later, the branch reopened under a different tone. The same doors, the same marble floors, but the air inside was quieter, not in volume, but in rhythm, as if everyone was waiting for something to return that hadn't yet arrived. Amy's desk remained empty. Victoria's name had been scraped off the glass. And in their place, new hires walked carefully, each step measured, each glance double-checked. But Marcus knew it wasn't about who filled the chairs, it was about who changed the culture. In the break room, conversations were hushed. Words hung in the air longer than usual, as if afraid to land. Some employees called what happened an overreaction. Others called it long overdue. Most called it nothing, hoping the storm would pass. But even in silence, truth has a way of lingering. Jamal noticed it first, the way customers now hesitated before approaching the counter, the way a few nodded at him more respectfully, the way some employees, the ones who used to laugh too loud at the wrong jokes, now kept their voices low. He stood near the lobby one afternoon, arms folded, watching as an elderly black woman walked in holding a worn leather purse. Her back straight, her steps slow but deliberate. The kind of presence that carried more memory than words. She approached the counter and was greeted by a young teller named Maria, one of the new hires. Jamal listened. The number was already saved. He tapped once. It rang. Then a voice answered, crisp, direct. Marcus spoke only 7 words. I need you at the branch. Now. A beat of silence followed. Then a breath on the other end. I will be there in 15. Marcus hung up, slid the phone back into his pocket. Jamal stood beside him, still silent, still watching. The street outside the bank carried on as if nothing had happened. Cars passed. Pedestrians moved. Thank you for not looking away. No name, no handwriting he recognized. Just a quiet acknowledgement. And in that small gesture, he realized something. Change doesn't always come with applause. Sometimes it arrives with quiet correction, with people who notice. At home, Marcus sat in his study surrounded by files, customer demographics, security reports, internal promotion stats. He didn't need more headlines, he needed more transparency. For years, the numbers had been tilted, not by intent, but by inertia. The kind of imbalance that slips in when systems are built for sameness. He made a call to the data team. I want a bias audit across all branches. Review approval rates, denial patterns, complaint logs. If any trend shows disparity, I want it flagged. He paused. And I want every branch manager retrained, not rebriefed, retrained. The voice on the other end hesitated. That's a massive operation. Marcus didn't flinch. So is the damage if we don't. The next morning, his directive was sent out. Not a memo, a mandate. And while some grumbled, most understood. This wasn't about Marcus anymore. It was about the mirror he had held up. The kind that didn't flatter. The kind that made people uncomfortable, but necessary. By the end of the month, customer satisfaction rose. Not because of gimmicks or discounts, but because people could feel the difference. Policies didn't change faces. Actions did. And for the first time in years, several clients wrote in not to complain, but to commend. One email read, "I used to come here expecting to prove myself. Now I come expecting to be served." That was the shift. Not in systems, but in expectations. Marcus read every word. Not for praise, but for measurement. Progress was not a moment. It was a discipline, a habit, a choice made every day by people who once believed silence was safer than speaking. Now they whispered differently. They whispered truth. And truth never stays quiet for long. At the far end of the Chicago branch, there was a single chair no one sat in. It had once belonged to Victoria, though it was never really hers. Power borrowed is never owned, and the chair, like the office, had been stripped of its silence. Now it remained empty, not as punishment, but as reminder, a symbol of consequence, but also of vacancy. The question was not who would sit there next, but what they would bring with them when they did, a title or a voice. Jamal passed the office every day on his way in. The glass walls were still there, but something about them felt different, transparent in a way they had never been. A few employees joked that the next manager would have to be made of stone. Jamal didn't laugh. He knew better. What this place needed was not stone. It needed sight. That afternoon, David Carter returned for a follow-up. No entourage, no clipboard, just a quiet check-in. He stepped into the empty office, looked around once, then turned to Jamal. "You ever thought about management?" Jamal blinked. "I'm security." David shrugged. So was Marcus in a way, protecting something. He smiled slightly. "The question is, can you lead people who once saw you as background?" Jamal didn't answer, not because he doubted himself, but because he understood the cost of that chair. It wasn't about sitting higher, it was about standing longer. And right now he wasn't ready. Not yet. Maybe one day, but not out of anger, out of clarity. Elsewhere, Marcus was speaking at a quiet panel, not televised, not recorded, just an internal discussion with new hires from across the state. He stood in front of them not as a CEO, but as a man who had been asked to leave his own building. He told the story plainly, without embellishment, without shame. They listened, not because he asked them to, but because the silence that had once swallowed people like him was breaking. Afterward, a young woman approached him. Her voice trembled slightly. "Thank you," she said. "I've been in rooms where I was seen as less." Marcus looked at her. "Then speak louder in the next one." She nodded, eyes shining. "You think it makes a difference." He smiled faintly. "Only every time." The days turned quieter. Not because the story had been forgotten, but because the real work had begun. New protocols were tested. Hiring panels diversified. Old assumptions were interrogated. The phrase "just following policy" no longer held weight. It was no longer a shield. It was an alarm. Employees started asking better questions. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to know what fairness actually looked like. And slowly, things shifted. Not loudly, but deeply. One afternoon, a customer entered the branch. Elderly white familiar. He walked up to Jamal at the security desk, paused, then extended a hand. "I saw what they did to you that day," he said. "I didn't say anything. I'm sorry." Jamal stared at the man's hand for a long second, then shook it. "Thank you," he said quietly. Not because it fixed anything, but because the apology, however late, had finally been spoken. Later that evening, Marcus returned to his office. Not the one downtown, the one at the branch. He walked past the empty chair, placed a hand on its backrest, then moved on. It would be filled one day, but only by someone who understood the cost of sitting, because that chair was no longer for watching, it was for choosing. It was a quiet morning when Marcus returned to the Chicago branch, not as a CEO on duty, but as a man checking the soil of a garden he once planted. The lobby was awake with movement, customers flowing in and out, employees speaking in measured tones, smiles soft but honest. It no longer felt like a machine. It felt like people. He walked slowly past the counters, past the polished tile where his footsteps had once echoed alone. Now the air carried warmth, not just efficiency, not just order. Something had shifted, and not just in policy, in culture. Jamal stood near the door, posture, steady gaze alert but softer now. He caught Marcus's eye and gave a quiet nod, not one of deference, one of shared knowing. Marcus returned it, then moved deeper into the building. A new branch manager was on duty. A young woman named Celeste, sharp eyes, confident shoulders, and a way of listening that made people feel seen. She greeted him not with surprise, but with readiness. She had studied the files. She knew the weight of the chair she filled, and she carried it without armor. In a conference room not far from the main lobby, Marcus met with a group of interns. Fresh faces, wide eyes, notebooks ready. He stood without a podium, without slides, just his voice. "Let me tell you something they won't teach in your training modules," he began. "The rooms you walk into will not always be fair. Some will measure your presence before they hear your voice. Some will ask you to prove what others are given by default. That does not mean you are less. It means the room is incomplete." He paused, letting the silence land. The intern sat still, drinking in the words, not just as instruction, but as permission. Permission to question, to belong, to hold space without shrinking. One of them raised a hand. "What did you do the first time they treated you like you didn't belong?" Marcus smiled faintly. "I remembered who built the room." The intern frowned. "You mean metaphorically?" Marcus shook his head. "Number, I built the bank." The room fell into a hush, not of awe, but of clarity. Because the moment you realize you have the power to build the room, everything changes. You stop asking for space, you start creating it. That is your task, not just to succeed, but to build rooms where people do not have to explain their worth before being served. Later that day, as he stepped outside into the Chicago light, Marcus paused at the curb. A little boy, maybe 10, stood beside his mother, staring through the glass doors. His hand tugged at her sleeve. Mom, is that the guy from the video? She nodded, smiling gently. Yes, that's Mr. Bennett. The boy waved shyly. Marcus lifted a hand in return, a smile tugging at the edge of his mouth. Not for recognition, but for what it meant. That somewhere in that little boy's mind, the idea of power had just been rewritten. Power that didn't shout. Power that didn't need a badge. Power that came with restraint, with dignity, with justice. As Marcus turned to walk away, his phone buzzed. A message from the board. New hiring policy approved. Audit schedule confirmed. Bias training renewed. He didn't reply. He didn't need to. Some answers didn't come through words. They came through presence, through proof. And as the doors of Bennett Financial closed behind him, Marcus Bennett knew one thing with absolute clarity. This time the room remembered his name.